I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've done in terms of creating support for user testing. I call this apples to oranges because one of the things that always comes up is, can you really compare EHR systems in terms of how they perform and how they succeed when some are very large systems designed to incorporate existing modules or small systems that are designed to tackle a specific kind of problem like orthopedic medicine. So the idea of comparing apples to oranges is a long-standing one as a way of saying you can't make a comparison because no matter how great an apple you have, it will always be a terrible orange. And this exists across all kinds of cultures. It's sweet potatoes to potatoes, and here it's EHR systems to EHR systems. And so what I want to discuss is what do we actually get when we start a discussion about how EHR systems stack up against one another, not necessarily in the domains that you may think. Because when EHR systems and the increase in adoption of EHR systems came out, there were tons of devices to help people pick what system do you want to use. There were blogs and websites and companies that would say, let me pick the right one for you. You could look at class reports. The Regional Extension Center said, come on, let me show you the differences between these systems. We'll find the one for you. And even HIT.gov allowed for meaningful use comparison tools. So what functions and functionalities are there? And so all of these initial comparisons were about features and functions, hosting systems, and most importantly, cost. So you could pick the one you want to work with. Now the question is not, which system are you going to select based on what it can do for you? But now let's talk about usability and comparisons for safety. And so as part of the 2014 certification requirements, including the need for usability, suddenly we can talk about the safety of these systems and how well they perform for the tasks as intended by end users. And so as part of this testing, as Mohammed alluded to, the idea was that you actually had to go through and for 8 of the meaningful use objectives, put your system to work and actually then report out your findings. The intention of that is not necessarily, again, to compare 2 systems one to the next because there are such differences in workflow. What pops up on any individual screen and how you maneuver through the systems may not be the same. But the idea is you're going to report things like task success, time to complete tasks, and these kinds of information can actually be compared. But here's the problem. When the actual reports came out, less than a third actually made public their CIF reports. So what we were left with is a discussion of what was included in the few systems that did share. So it makes it difficult to know what's happening in the other systems who elected to only report that usability testing was conducted without providing more of the nitty-gritty details. In terms of what was reported, these brave souls shared a lot. They explained the variation in their procedures and reporting. There was variation that some systems would report by seconds versus minutes to complete tasks. Some reported things like it happened within our target time without ever saying what the target time was. But they were reporting it took about this amount of time to complete something like entering a new medication, entering a lab. It at least starts a dialogue of could they get through the process. Where you start understanding there has to be a lot of variation in what they did is when you start looking at things like test duration. Some groups reported their the entire test time took only 5 minutes. Others reported up to 4 hours. This suggests that there's a lot of variation in what they're actually doing when they go in to do these kinds of tests. The number of participants ranged in many studies from as few as 2 to as many as 19, and who those participants were varied. Some of the systems did a great job setting up rigorous scenarios where they tried to modify it to fit the appropriate use of their system. So if it was an orthopedic system, they tried to use orthopedic labs, orthopedic drugs and things. But then they tested it on system administrators. So there's a little mismatch between how things got built out and who they got tested on. Additionally, some of the test scenarios were quite prescriptive. One of the systems involved literally walking them through step by step and telling them click here, click here, click here. The problems with that, it doesn't allow you to discover anything with this kind of user testing. What you're finding is the minimal variation in how long it takes people to read your instructions and locate items on the screen. But there were lots and lots of wonderful things in these reports. They did provide the sort of feedback that we tried to do in our initial RUA reports of saying, hey, 90% of our testers complained about the pop-ups. And we did have difficulties with some of our workflows. And so they did seem to engender a discussion, at least within the teams, about the kinds of problems their systems may be facing. What they didn't provide was a way to start a discussion of comparing across systems for what are some things that we need to have a broader discussion about. Where are the big safety concerns? Is it in CDS? Is it in the workflow? Where do we really need to talk about how we need collectively to adjust our systems? So to support this user testing, a number of things happened prior to the 2014 testing boom. The NIST resources, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, actually provided the EHR usability protocol that walked through all of the components that might be included in your user testing, including testing sites, consent forms, NDA disclosures, as well as some broad testing protocols that you could follow. And we did have some input into those materials as well. And so these were a good starting place. The ONC themselves actually provided test data sets that say, here is a set of data, including patient histories, that could be included in these tests. Unfortunately, it is the case that it does not appear that a lot of this actually made it into the testing procedures. Quite often you would see things like when they reported out their scenarios, it would say, order a statin, without actually telling the participants which statin to order. That creates immense variability in how long it's going to take to perform that task, what immediately comes to mind, and really tweaking what might be in the system. Others were more prescriptive because of the population that they used. So when they used admins, they actually had to tell them what to do because the admins wouldn't have that in their own minds. So again, it's a different kind of testing. What we've been doing as part of SHARP-C is actually trying to help create protocols for more uniform testing, but building them off of real-world data so that they would ring true to the end users. So our idea was that we would build scenarios that were based for physicians and nurses that should reflect the kinds of cases that they're used to seeing so that we would get a test of the system as it might be used. Now, Dr. Norman pointed out that testing in the lab is very different than testing in the real world, but we were trying to at least bring in the values and the kinds of patients you might expect to see into the lab setting. So what we did is we replicated test participants in our scenarios experienced by using the most frequent drugs and frequent conditions. We based it off of very large data sets to improve ecological validity. So our cases were based off of 2 major metropolitan area data sets that included one set that had 100,000 patients in it. And what we did is we went in and we queried the data sets to figure out what are the common number of problems added per visit? What are the common number of drugs listed on a medication list? So that at least this would replicate the kind of conditions that you were expecting. Now, most of the testing scenarios, when you would say enter CPOE for medication, would list 1. And we know that it should be about 3. But it is also the case that many of them were not at the extreme of having a list of 10 or 15 problems or 10 or 15 drugs, which do actually happen with patients. So in addition to creating scenarios for the 8 main test cases, we then created some more advanced cases that actually stretched the needs of the system, having longer patient lists, longer medication lists. We tried some more advanced CDS that would require more features than simply drug-drug interaction, but age and weight. And what we were aiming for is to create some scenarios that the community doing the testing could pull from either as templates or as simply suggestions for how you might run this information. So in each of our test scenarios, and they're all posted on the web, and there's folders somewhere that actually have snippets of them. They'll actually walk you through the case where we produce the information for the user as both a protocol and as a table with the information so that it doesn't just have the you have to then read and retain, but actually it'll give you a memory aid in terms of these are the drugs to enter. But that it fits with user expectation and user experience in terms of, yes, I prescribe a lot of Lipitor versus I prescribe whatever somebody else pulled out of a drug dictionary. Now, what's really great is in 2014, we had a push for usability, and in the 2015 proposed rules, we now have a chance to go back in and say, what additional information might we like to see? And so this is currently up for comment, and some of the notions that are being included are things like, should formative usability tests be explicitly required? Or can they be used as substitutes for summative testing? So where in the testing process do we want people to start reporting information? It's good to know what they're changing early on in the system and be able to provide insight into how that system should be restructured, as well as having some idea of where they're at the time of commercial release. Additionally, there's discussion about whether or not explicit usability tests should be used. So should there be something in terms of a standardized testing procedure? If so, that will give us a closer notion of how two systems compare. But again, we have to always understand that variation in time is not nearly as important as the task success or task failure of completing those activities. Because the structure of the EHR systems may lead to different workflows, and those different workflows may be reflected in time. I'm much more interested in knowing, can you successfully do these tasks in the system, and if not, what are the barriers to it, rather than knowing it took 3 seconds more to complete this task in the second EHR. And it is important to say that in these reports, people were quite honest. Not every system passed every test, and in fact, some people had very, very low success rates, but they reported it. And that gives you some idea of where they're working on in their system and what features are currently ready to roll. And additionally, in the 2015 proposed rules, there's a suggestion that perhaps there will be a minimum number of test subjects. Having 2 people really doesn't give you as much information as having 20 people. I think one addition that we will make in our response to the proposed rulemaking will also be a suggestion for the roles of those participants. The amount of prior experience with the system also differed. So some of the differences that you see in how they create the system had to do with the needs of taking a naive audience through the tasks. And so more constraint in how the protocols are created will lead to more similarity in the findings. But what I wanted to say is you can't actually compare apples to oranges. You can't compare them and say an apple is a good orange or not. But you can say they're both pieces of fruit. You can say that they have this many calories and they have this degree of size. And so we can compare EHRs to say what portion of the tasks successfully got through usability testing. Where were the safety precautions that are built into the system and the saving graces? And where are the remaining risks? And just as a point to the tongue-in-cheek publishing you can do, there are 2 published studies literally comparing apples to oranges, and one is in the British Medical Journal. So, thank you very much.